this program is something we thought of a couple of years ago. We have a very in-depth training program for Zen Peacemakers, for the Zen Peacemaker Order. And it's a heavy lift. It's a 2-year commitment. We meet most Fridays for 2 years, and there's 8 or 10 modules of focus. And that's really a lot for many people. So we thought, how do we identify, the really most fundamental, the foundational practices, or I don't like the word concepts so much, but I'll go ahead and use it, the fundamental practices and concepts of Zen Peacemakers, and make it accessible to everybody, just really, 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 easy, no barrier to entry at all. And that's how we ended up here tonight. We do 4 different topical focuses. This is called core trainings. Sensei Daikan is going to do one on the 3 Tenets this evening, if I'm reading my schedule correctly. We do one on introduction to meditation. We do one on an introduction to council practice, and an introduction to the quite unique approach to peacemaking that the Zen Peacemakers embody. And they're each an hour. They're free. They're open. There's no prerequisites. You can take the same one 3-4 times a year if you'd like. You can repeat them as you want. So that's how we are where we are tonight. So, and we really do consider these 4 focus areas to be just primary for what it is that we do. So with that brief introduction, and with 3 bows of gratitude to my friend Jim Daikan, Sensei Jim, I will pass the microphone and the talking stick. And Daikan, I will spotlight you, but if that bugs you, you can select your gallery view back, so you're not looking at yourself. And it'll direct the recording. So there you go. And I'm going to mute now. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So good evening and welcome, everyone, to this introductory workshop on the Zen Peacemakers 3 Tenets. So we have about an hour, and I'm going to use this time in several ways. I'm going to define each of the 3 tenets for you and illustrate the tenets with some Zen stories. And then after we get through that part of the workshop, I'm going to pose a situation and ask you to see how you might apply the 3 tenets to this particular case that I'm going to bring up. And then we'll also have time for questions and comments. So my teacher, Roshi Bernie Glassman, founded the Zen Peacemakers in 1994. He had originally trained with Taizan Maizumi Roshi at Zen Center of Los Angeles, received Dharma transmission from Maizumi, and then left California and moved to New York, in particular Yonkers, New York. And Bernie began practicing with a number of students who followed him from California, and they took up residence in Yonkers with Bernie at this place called Grayston. And they started to practice together. And some of you may be familiar with this, others may not, but when one becomes a formal Zen student, you go through a ceremony called Jukai. And there are like 16 bodhisattva precepts that you take, and you're given a Dharma name, and you sow a Raksu, and you become a formal student. And 3 of those 16 precepts are called the 3 pure precepts. And they are: cease from doing harm, do only good, and do good for others. And Bernie was really kind of moving Zen practice out of the Zendo to a certain extent and into society, and particularly into the work environment with the establishment of what became known as the Grayston Bakery. And so a lot of the students would sit in a zendo on the second floor. And then during the day, they'd run downstairs and work in the bakery all day and then go sit in the evening. And they were asking Bernie, you know, if there was a way to make the three pure precepts as actionable items. And so with that challenge, Bernie came up with the three tenets, which are not knowing, bearing witness, and taking action. And they're kind of at the heart of all of the things that we do as Zen peacemakers. So let me define the first tenet, which is not knowing. And that is defined as letting go of fixed ideas about yourself, others, and the universe. Not knowing is entering in a situation without being attached to your opinion, idea, or concept. And this results in you being kind of open and allows for deep listening, you know, because most of our daily mental activity is involved in conceptualizing, problem solving, evaluating, comparing, contrasting, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And not knowing is really about using all of your tools without attachment. And we'll get into that in a moment. So I want to revisit a little bit, you know, basic Buddhism. There's a couple of things that you may already know, but there's two very important principles to be aware of. And one is called the principle of interdependence. It's also known as dependent arising. And the idea behind this principle is that everything in the universe is related to everything in the universe, okay? That the universe is one constantly interconnected, unfolding process, and it is at its base relational. The other principle is not only is everything interdependent, but everything is changing every single moment, everywhere in the universe. So you have the interdependent nature, relational nature of the universe, and what we call impermanence. Everything is changing. Okay. So the person you were when you signed on here a few minutes ago is not the person you are now. Okay. And the person you're going to be 5 minutes from now is not the person you are now, nor is the universe, nor is anything. So these are very fundamental ideas about Buddhism. So when the Buddha attained enlightenment, one of the first things he did was he talked about the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is that life is marked with suffering. That in Sanskrit, the word is dukkha. And it's kind of translated as unsatisfactoriness, this kind of constant dis-ease with things that, you know, we are seeking happiness and positive interactions, and we attain those things, but then, you know, they gradually go away, and then we have this feeling of dis-ease again. Okay. What's interesting about the word dukkha is when you look at that from its Sanskrit derivative, the word dukkha means a hub of a wheel that's stuck. So the wheel can't turn, right? It's in a fixed position. And this is a metaphor for being stuck in fixed ideas about things. That because everything is interconnected and everything is changing, right? When we start to fixate on things having to be a particular way, in other words, it can't change. I won't allow it to change. I don't want it to change. Therein, we're going to experience some suffering. We're either going to experience suffering, and not only for ourselves, but probably cause some suffering for other people around us. Okay. So there's a little kind of story that kind of illustrates this a little bit metaphorically. In Asian countries, there are people that hunt monkeys and sell them in the marketplace. And the way they do that is they have these clay pots that, are about, yay tall. And they're really thin openings on the top, and they're kind of empty and bigger in the bottom. And they put a banana in there. The monkeys love bananas. So the monkey comes, sticks its hand into the pot, grabs the banana, and tries to pull the banana out. But because their desire mind is so strong, they won't let go of that banana. They just keep pulling it and pulling it and pulling it. And in the process, they're stuck there. So then the people who harvest the monkeys just come along and bop them on the head. And that's how, they get these monkeys. The metaphor here is learning to let go of the banana, right? The monkeys could just let go of the banana. They would have been free from that situation. And a lot of times the banana is our thoughts, concepts, and ideas. So let's talk about a very famous koan. Some of you may be aware of it. It has to do with Emperor Wu, who was the emperor of China. So it's about 500-600 AD. Buddhism had spread from India into China in the early 11 and 1200s. And Emperor Wu became a devotee of Buddhism. And as a result, he built a lot of temples and he supported a lot of monks. And he just, was really proud of everything that he had accomplished. Bodhidharma, who was the 28th patriarch of Buddhism, a direct mind-to-mind transmission going all the way back to the Buddha, decided to leave India and travel to China. And the emperor heard he was coming and obviously got very, very excited. And Bodhidharma ended up meeting with the emperor, and the emperor told Bodhidharma that he had built all these Buddhist temples and supported the Sangha. And he asked Bodhidharma what merit he had received for all of this good work. And Bodhidharma said, none whatsoever. Well, the emperor didn't quite understand. And then he said, well, what is the ultimate meaning of the holy truths of Buddhism? And Bodhidharma answered, vast emptiness, nothing holy. And then the emperor said, well, who is it that stands here then? And Bodhidharma said, don't know. So what's going on here? What's going on between these two? Well, it turns out that the Buddhism that was had come into China was based on, certain principles like the law of karma, for example. And in the law of karma, the idea is that you engage in certain behaviors, and as a result of engaging in those behaviors, you attain a certain amount of merit. And then that merit helps you to get a good rebirth the next time you're, on the next turn of the wheel, so to speak. So the emperor was really about, trying to impress Bodhidharma with all the things that he had done, all the achievements he had attained through all his work, right? But what he didn't understand is that that really wasn't the essence of what Bodhidharma was there to teach, okay? Stephen Batchelor, I don't know, some of you may be familiar with his works, but he's written some great books on Buddhism. He's a secular Buddhist. He was a monk at one time. And he wrote a book called Alone with Others, which is kind of a book that looks at Zen practice and Buddhist practice from an existentialist perspective, okay? And what he talked about in that book was that there's two basic verbs in the English language, to be and to have. And depending on how you're living your life, whether you're living a life of being or a life of having, your life turns out to be very different. So the emperor was very much living a life of having. It was about, I did this, I did that, I've done this, I've done that. And it was good stuff. It was great that he had actually done all those things. But it was really, in his mind, more about achieving something, attaining something, getting something, right? Whereas Bodhidharma was really about trying to teach just being, right? And when one is in a state of being, they're right here, right now, moment to moment to moment to moment. Okay. So a lot of Zen practice, and particularly the tenet of not knowing, is coming back to just this, over and over and over again. What is this? Is a very famous Zen koan. What is this? What is this right here, right now? Because the past doesn't actually exist other than in our mind. The future doesn't actually exist other than in our imagination. The only thing that really exists is what's happening right in this moment. So if you're in this moment doing what you're doing while you're doing it, then you are practicing Zen. I'll give you another anecdote. There was this college professor who taught philosophy and religion, and he was a huge scholar of Zen. And he had written a lot of books, and he was kind of an expert, and he was asked to attend conferences, and his works were often cited in academia. But his big wish was someday he wanted to meet a real Zen master, right? I mean, he learned all about it conceptually and through books, et cetera, but he wanted to have a real experience with a Zen master. And he finally got a chance to travel to Japan, and he got an audience with a particular Zen master. And they were seated in a little room together, and there was a couple of cups and a little pot of tea. And the professor just, went on and on and on and just shared everything that he could think of that he knew about Zen with the Zen teacher, the Zen master. And the Zen master just kind of sat there, not saying anything. And finally, this professor kind of ran out of gas. And he finally said, well, what do you think? And the Zen master said, would you like some tea? And the professor said, yeah, sure. And the Zen master said, hold out your cup. So he held out his cup. And the Zen master, and this is hot tea, he started pouring the tea into the cup. And he poured it until it overflowed the top of the cup onto the professor's hand. And he kind of pulled his hand back and he said, well, what did you do that for? He was a little bit stunned. And the Zen master said, you came here to learn about Zen, but you're so full of your own ideas, nothing else can go in right now. You must first empty your cup. Again, getting to that mind before thinking, before conceptualizing. I don't know how many of you have read Shunryu Suzuki's famous book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Has anybody ever read that book? Okay. Do you remember what the kind of the quintessential quote from that book is? Yeah, in the mind of a beginner, there are many possibilities. In the mind of an expert, there are but a few. I don't know, what kind of work you folks do and, what your livelihood is, but it's always been interesting to me. Before I retired, when I worked for the VA for a long time. And when new staff would get hired into the program, that's when they had the most questions and actually questioned what we were doing. People who had been there for years didn't question it anymore. They just kind of went along with the bureaucracy. So it was always interesting to see how that beginner's mind would show up in people. in various situations. Another example is Zen Master Dogen, who is the founder of the lineage of the Zen Peacemakers. In the 13th century, he wrote about not knowing in his universal recommendation of the principles of Zazen. He had actually trained in Japan, got Dharma transmission from Isai, who was a Rinzai master who actually brought Zen to Japan in the 13th century. But Dogen didn't feel like he was complete, that he felt he had really finished his studies. So he went to China for 6 years. And eventually attained enlightenment there with Rujing, a very famous Chinese master. Came back to Japan and he wrote what was called the Fukan Zazengi, which was the universal recommendations of Zazen, which was kind of like a primer and a manifesto regarding Zen meditation and Zen practice. And in the Fukan Zazengi, he wrote, once you have adjusted your posture, take a deep breath, inhale and exhale, rock your body right and left, and settle into steady, immobile sitting position. And this is key. He then said, think of not thinking. How do you think of not thinking? And then he said, non-thinking. So what is non-thinking? What is that? What is it? Now, how do you do it? Right? So another very famous Zen teacher talked about this in regard to our everyday life. Okay? His name was Joshu, and he asked his master Nansen, what is the way? Which is like asking, what is the truth of reality? What is Buddhism? What is the way? And Nansen said, ordinary mind is the way. Joshu asked, well, how do I seek it? And Nansen replied, if you seek for it, you will go in the wrong direction. Joshu then replied, well, if I don't seek it, I will never know what it is. And then Nansen replied, the way is neither knowing or not knowing. Knowing is delusion. Not knowing is indifference. Just a little note, Nansen's term not knowing is not the non-knowing of the Zen Peacemakers, which I'll clarify in a moment. It's just like, I don't know something, right? It's kind of a state of ignorance. Like, how many miles is it to the sun? I don't know. It's that kind of not knowing, right? As opposed to, oh, well, it's 93 million miles, which would be knowing. So that's knowing and not knowing. The not knowing Nansen is speaking to is that non-thinking, okay? In another example, a monk asked Yao Shan, what are you thinking in steadfast, immovable sitting? So he saw this monk sitting and he said, what are you doing here, right? What are you thinking, right? And Yao Shan said, I think of not thinking. The monk asked, how do you think of not thinking? Yao Shan said, beyond thinking. So what is this mind beyond thinking, non-thinking, not knowing, right? So another Japanese Zen master named Uchiyama Roshi wrote a book called Opening the Hand of Thought. Okay. And what's important to understand here is that non-thinking, beyond thinking, not knowing is not anti-intellect or anti-concepts, right? All that really is pointing to is that concepts have a very limited usefulness. So we should always hold them lightly, okay? Because things that we used to believe in that we thought were absolutely true are now seen to be completely untrue. I mean, at one point, the world believed that the world was flat, right? So, we could go over, every century, there's been all kinds of things that people firmly believed in that turned out to be not the case necessarily, right? So Uchiyama Roshi would say, the practice of non-thinking is kind of like this, you see those little thought bubbles you see, in cartoons and stuff, right? So someone might be thinking to themselves, oh, I got to go to the dentist. And then that leads to, oh, but when is that? Is that tomorrow? I better look it up. And then that leads to, oh, geez, it's on Wednesday. That's not going to work because my car's going to be in the shop on Wednesday. And then that leads to, who am I going to find to give me a ride? There's no taxi service around here. I wonder if my neighbor will take me, right? So that's where one thought leads to another thought, to another thought, to another thought, to another thought, which pretty much characterizes the way we think. When we're practicing non-thinking, and this might be, for example, a good place to explore this is when you're sitting on a cushion doing zazen, right? What Uchiyama Roshi would say is, when that first thought is, I have to go to the dentist, you notice that thought, and then you just come back to your posture. And when you do that, the thought train does not continue. That's the practice of non-thinking. It's an actual technique. Okay. And every time you come back to just this, without going off on a thought train, you strengthen your ability to keep your mind right here, right now, attending to exactly what you're doing while you're doing it. How many times have you gone down the interstate and you're supposed to get off on exit 7, and all of a sudden you look up and you just passed exit 9, and you don't even know where you were for those 2 exits because you were lost in the mind dream, right? That's not necessarily good or bad unless you're in a big rush to get to exit 7. But that's kind of the way the mind works, right? So we can go off on these thought trains and they can lead us all kinds of places. There's some interesting research that now shows that when we're not engaged in a particularly focused activity, that the brain actually defaults to a particular mode, which is nonlinear, random, negative, and self-referential. Chatter, a lot of chatter. So let's talk about the 6th patriarch now. The 6th patriarch is considered like the first patriarch of Zen in China. Okay. And he came about 6 transmissions after Bodhidharma had arrived. And he defined practice, Zen practice, as a state of mind in which there is no separation between subject and object, no space between I and thou, you and me, up and down, right or wrong. He said, I call such practice bearing witness. According to this definition, when we do zazen, we bear witness to the oneness of life. So now think about it like this. If you're driving your car, right, and you're just driving your car, you're paying attention to what you're doing while you're doing it, chances are you're never going to miss your exit because you're going to be right where you need to be while you're doing it, right? That is Zen practice. according to the sixth patriarch, and my teacher, Roshi Bernie Glassman, right? So when he was working in the bakery and they were making donuts, right? Doing what they were doing while they were doing it, he said to his students, "You're training in Zen." Now, a lot of folks who came to California from California, they didn't buy that. And they left. They said, that's not Zen practice. But what they hadn't realized was something that Bernie knew on a much deeper level, which is sitting on a cushion in a Zendo is a form of Zen practice, but it's not all of Zen practice. And not even necessarily the most important part. Because when we are really paying attention to what's happening right here, right now, the sense of I, my condition, my situation, my relationship, my function tends to disappear. Think of a time when you were awed by something, like really awed by something. Maybe it was a sunset over the ocean, or a bird, beautiful bird singing outside your window, or the birth of a child. But there are peak experiences that we have in life where we are so drawn into the moment that the sense of I, my, me actually disappears. And there's no separation. So Master Jizo asked Hogan, where have you come from? Hogan said, well, I pilgrimage aimlessly. What is the nature of your pilgrimage? Asked Jizo. I don't know, replied Hogan. Not knowing is most intimate, remarked Master Jizo. At that, Hogan experienced great enlightenment. So when we're really, really, really in the moment, that's when things are most intimate. You know, when Hogan said, I pilgrimage aimlessly, it's a kind of a metaphor for life, right? We're on this journey. You know, we were born, we took our first breath. We're going to breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, and breathe out. We don't know how many times, and then we're going to take our last breath. And that'll be it. So we're on this journey, right? Some of the sweetest things in life are those moments of sheer, unadulterated closeness, intimacy. Even the intimacy of being completely present while drinking tea. And when you're in that state of not knowing, beyond thinking, completely intimate with what's happening, many say they feel it to be a spiritual experience. So let's talk about bearing witness. So when we approach things with a mind of not knowing, being very present and intimate with what's unfolding, okay, we actually enter into an ability to work with others in whatever way is most meaningful and helpful. When we bear witness, we become the situation. So this is a quote from Bernie: homelessness, poverty, illness, violence, death, the right action arises of itself. We don't have to worry about what to do. We don't have to figure out the solutions ahead of time. Compassionate action is the functioning of bearing witness. Once we listen with our entire body and mind, loving action arises. Now, I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I have a private practice, but for many, many years, I worked for the VA and I worked with veterans that were charged with felony offenses. And so I spent a lot of time in prisons and testifying in court and developing treatment plans for them to try and turn their lives around so they didn't have to be sentenced to jail time. And in order to do that effectively, I had to really, go into the prisons, go into their homes, go out on the streets, find them underneath bridges, really try and, bear witness to exactly what they were experiencing, knowing that I would, fail most of the time to really, really appreciate and thoroughly understand their situation. But I was going to try and bear witness anyway. And so I was always concerned about, what's my best way of helping, these folks, right? These terrible situations. I also ran all the homeless programs for veterans in the entire state of Vermont and half of the state of New Hampshire. So I had a lot of experience working with the homeless veteran community and the homeless community in general. And I came across this quote one time from young men who said, "What are the teachings of a whole lifetime?" And young men replied, "An appropriate response." So what is an appropriate response when we're trying to help somebody? Right? How do we know that what we're offering is going to work? The answer is, you don't know. You don't. You can't know until you do something, right? Think about this for a moment, right? Ever since we took our first breath, we've been learning. We've been continuously exposed to conditions that are continuously changing. Things are rising, maintaining, dissolving, appearing and disappearing, right? And we learn from this history of conditioning. It's in our pathways in our brain, right? And so we're carrying all of this information. And then we encounter a situation which has its own set of conditions that are typically novel. And the confluence of our learning history and this new situation will result in us behaving in a certain way at a certain point, at a certain time. Now, we can't step outside of our experience and be something other than we've never been. Right? Like right now, I'm talking to you, you're listening to me, we're not in Philadelphia eating a hot dog. I mean, we can't step out of this experience and be some other place, doing some other thing. We can only do what we're doing while we're doing it. So from that perspective, whatever you do is an appropriate response. It's the only response that's available to you. Now, you may not like the response a few seconds later, but that's a different response now. And you may then adjust the next thing you do because that's not part of your conditioning history, right? So we're moving along, encountering the moment, and we're also dragging all this history with us as part of this process. And not knowing and bearing witness is learning to kind of look at that conditioning and hold it lightly, right? Not be totally dominated by that history, our mind habits, our conditioning. Bernie once said, "The point is not to make ourselves holy. The point is to serve, to offer, to actually be the offering ourselves. And when we do that, of itself, the fruit is born. Out of our zazen, out of our bearing witness, the right action arises. We don't have to worry about what to do. We don't have to worry about what's right or wrong. If we function from the state of not knowing, if we bear witness, the offering arises, the fruit is born. When I would be working with these convicted felons, there were times, and this happens in my private practice, I don't know what to do. I really don't know what to do in the moment, right? But one thing I do know is if I'm present with the client or with my friends or a partner, right? Together, we'll figure it out. If we're willing to be in relationship with each other in an open way, we'll figure it out. I have clients that deal with a lot of anxiety, and which is fear of the future. Basically, that's what anxiety is. It's the fear of an imagined future. I always remind them. I said, when in your past have you not been able to solve a problem, either directly yourself or with the help of someone else or something you read, or have you ever been so completely stuck that you had a major catastrophe? And they always say no. And so the obvious question is, so what are we worried about? If we can stay in the moment and be present with what is, we'll engage in an appropriate response of some kind. Of itself, the fruit is born. The hardest thing I had to learn was to trust that. To trust not knowing that if I don't have fixed ideas, I won't end up being stymied. I will actually discover something creative. There's a funny story about this Chinese character named Master Pang, and his daughter. The whole family were enlightened. So imagine this, right? The mother, the father, the daughter, they're all enlightened. And he would work with his daughter, and they would sell things to people in the village. And one day he slipped and fell down this bank, and it almost ended up in the river, and he was laying there flat on his back. And his daughter, Ling Chao, ran down and threw herself on the ground next to him, basically mirroring what he had happened. And he turned to her and he said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm helping you." Because she was becoming the situation, right? She wanted to become exactly the situation. And even if that she didn't help him up, which I think she must have, just that kind of support, right, can be very nourishing. So in order to effectively bear witness to another person, we have to kind of let go of the I, my, me thing a little bit, right? Which brings us into a more intimate relationship with the other. And it said, the actualization of realization is nothing other than love and compassion and service to others. My teacher used to say, you can gauge the depth of someone's enlightenment by the extent to which they're in service to others. What are we doing on time here? All right, so let's do the case example. So I'm going to tell you a little story, and then I'm going to ask you guys to see if, or kind of test if, what I've shared with you is been helpful to you. So I'm going to share this little story, and I want you to kind of listen and figure out where not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action comes in to this story, okay? So this is about a couple of monks. Tanzan and Aikido were once traveling together down a muddy road. A heavy rain was still falling. Coming around a bend, they met a lovely girl in a silk kimono and sash, unable to cross the intersection. "Come on, girl," said Tanzan at once. Lifting her in his arms, he carried her over the mud. Ikido did not speak again, the younger monk, that is, until that night when they reached the lodging temple. Then he could no longer restrain himself. In challenging the older monk Tanzan, he said, "We monks don't go near females, especially not young and lovely ones. It is dangerous. Why did you do that?" And Tanzan replied, "I left that girl there. Are you still carrying her?" So what's going on here? Anybody want to take a stab at this?
I think we can see everybody. So if you'd like to speak, just wave your hand and unmute, and we're a small enough group. Or if you'd like to use your electronic hand, it's down under React. Somebody's reaching for the unmute button. Yeah. Allison, I saw you moving around.
Yeah. That's a great story. Thanks, Daikan, for reciting that. It seems like that the older monk let go of all the trappings of being this learned monk that knew all the rules and regulations that might have said to him, "Don't touch this woman," and yet in his witness of her suffering, he let all that go and said, "Shit, I'm gonna help her. She's suffering. Let's get this young lady over the thing," whatever that was, the lake in the middle of the road. But the young monk was clinging to, all that trapping, and it bound him up so tightly that he couldn't figure out a way to bear witness or act on it. Yeah.
Very good, Allison.
Terry, I saw you. You've gone away, Terry. You had your electronic hand up. If you want to go ahead and share.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just going to say that is it very much an example of this, the monk that the first monk that carried the woman, an example of not knowing. He dropped his attachments to the ideas of what monks should be. It's a very prime example of not knowing. And just being human.
Which is what we're all hoping for. Yeah, I'll give you a little more context in the story. Back in kind of ancient China, when this was unfolding, there were certain times of the year where the monks from one temple would go and visit another temple, a different temple, with a different teacher, and so that they could study with them as well. And then they'd return eventually to their own temple. And so, there weren't a lot of roads, and there was no real transportation in those days. So they would walk from one temple to the next. And when they became priests, they took a lot of precepts. And one of the precepts, obviously, was having to do with chastity. And they weren't even supposed to look at attractive women or women in general. And this was, a precept that they had vowed to practice. And then the other aspect of this was that when they would set out in the morning, they would take a vow of silence. So at sunrise, and they wouldn't speak to each other until sundown. And they always paired a senior monk with a relatively new monk, kind of show them the ropes. So the younger monk, Aikido, was really much following the rules, right? He was trying to be the best monk he could be. He didn't say anything when he saw Tanzan, carry this young, beautiful woman across this muddy creek. But as soon as the sun went down, he had to speak up. Now think of what it must have been like to be him, right? Like, this probably happened like early in the morning. And so his mind was just spinning probably throughout the rest of the day. That's why he kind of like, as soon as the sun went down, he kind of confronted Tanzan. And this is kind of the difference between what we call rule-governed behavior and behavior that is following the natural contingencies of change, right? And the irony of this story is that Tanzan, by breaking the rules, right, engaged in a loving and compassionate act, right? Seeing what the situation was, immediately bearing witness and then taking action. So that not knowing, bearing witness, take action can happen just like that. It doesn't have to be this big, long process. It can just see it, boom. And I'm sure Aikido, this was a very powerful teaching for him, a very powerful teaching for him. Yeah. So I guess, I don't know how comfortable you feel like this, but can you think of anything in your own life, a situation where, you had a certain rule or a certain fixed idea about something that you were able to work with that along these lines of bearing witness, not knowing, loving action? Yes, Laura. Thank you.
Sure. I'm a teacher and I've had a lot of rules that I was taught, particularly by teachers in my family. Don't ever apologize. Don't ever apologize. That will make you look weak. And plus, I'm small in stature. I'm female. So it's like, don't do that. And, some incidences where that was what I had to do, And yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how we can form things out of knowing. I'll just share a quick little anecdote. But when I was working with Bernie got a appointment at Harvard Divinity School to teach the Buddhist Studies program. And I was like his right-hand guy. And so we lived in Western Mass, so we had to drive the whole state of Massachusetts to get to Harvard. And he loved to smoke cigars. So we would like smoke cigars on the way down in his car. He'd go in and give the class. And I would get down to Harvard Square and just kind of hang out while he was over at Harvard teaching the class. And I can remember one day I was standing in Harvard. Has anybody ever been to Harvard Square? Any of you ever been there? You kind of know what that is. So I'm leaning up against this wall at Harvard Square, and there's like 4 streets that come together, and there's a subway, and there's this huge sea of people that are constantly milling around the area. And I was sitting there, and these people would walk by and say, "Oh, that person's probably a student." Oh, and I bet you that person's a professor. Or, oh, this person, I don't know, he looks like a business person, but he looks a little shady to me, And oh, this person looks really unhappy, right? And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, it hit me. I didn't know anything about these people.
Exactly.
Nothing. That I was completely making this thing up in my knowing mind. And then I also then realized I do this all day, every day. right? What am I missing? What am I missing? So even when you're hanging out, with your friends or you're at the car wash, when thoughts come up, just hold them lightly, right? Just hold them lightly.
Daikan, I think you timed it just perfectly. We're coming right up to the end of our time. Thank you. Really approachable and lucid and colorful description of the three tenets. And I love that you use so many stories and anecdotes, both kind of classical and personal. It's wonderful. I hope everyone was able to glean something from this, and be able to perhaps take it into your personal life and have it working with this as a practice question is an excellent thing to do, to rather than having it just be a conversation with Daikan one evening, last month sometime. Seeing how it can manifest in your day is a wonderful thing to do. So I wish you well with that, and we are at the end of our time. I will put in a program plug here before we say goodnight. We're partway into an 8-part series. I'm guessing somebody here maybe has attended a few of these. Our good friend who Daikan knows well, Roshi, Eve, Myon, and Marco, has been doing a series on aging. Now, I realize as I look around the Zoom, this doesn't really apply to anybody here, but maybe, imagine someday. Um, and she's done, he said, tongue in cheek, as he's going to turn 72 in a month. She's done 3 of the 8 sessions so far, and the 4th one is coming up a week from Wednesday, and it's noon East Coast time. Again, it's free. Go to the website, you can register. We've gotten a huge response, and people are really enjoying it. So I highly recommend it. Series on aging, Roshi, Eve, Marco, on Wednesday, December 18 at noon US Eastern time. So join us if you can. And I ran a little bit over. Daikan, once again, thank you so much. We really value and appreciate you taking your time and sharing your wisdom and your perspective. And everyone stay safe, stay healthy,